I stood there, my hand frozen midair as I held the slip of paper, feeling like someone had knocked the air out of me. The small, crumpled receipt in my fingers was no ordinary one. Tiffany and Company, and not just any trinket either, but a $10,000 necklace. The sort of thing she would have flaunted, made sure I'd seen. But that necklace had never crossed the threshold of our home, not that I'd noticed. So who was it for? Who was she with? I could feel my heart pounding, hot anger mixed with cold disbelief rushing over me in waves. The house was quiet. Claire was at work. At least, she'd said she'd be, and I stood alone in my study, clutching that damning piece of paper, all my certainty about my life slipping out from under me. I had to calm down, breathe, think this through. We'd been married for almost 10 years. We were the couple everyone looked up to, successful, stable, in love. Friends envied us, co-workers admired us, neighbors adored us. We'd built a solid life, a good life, or so I thought. But looking at that slip, all I could feel was a dark chasm of doubt. I was spiraling, already imagining the worst, even though I barely had any proof. But there were other signs, weren't there? Little things I'd dismissed, brushing them off as work stress, or maybe I was just imagining things. She'd been working late more often, saying she was bogged down with projects and deadlines. She'd started taking weekend trips with her girlfriends, too, something she'd never shown an interest in before. I remembered wondering, just briefly, why she didn't invite me to join her. But I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, in the quiet of my study, with only that crumpled receipt as witness, all those ignored warning signs took on a sinister weight. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through our recent conversations, looking for anything out of place. She was warm and casual, maybe even more affectionate than usual, which now seemed like an attempt to cover her tracks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was overreacting. She couldn't be cheating, not Claire, not my wife. Maybe it was a gift for a friend, a piece she was planning to return or exchange. But then, why hadn't she mentioned it? We told each other everything, didn't we? After a few more minutes, my hands shaking, I made a decision. I had to know the truth. I was done pretending, done ignoring the signs. If there was something to find, I'd find it. And if I was wrong, if I really was just letting a scrap of paper mess with my head, I'd have to live with that. But if I was right, no, I wasn't even ready to think that far ahead. That night, I acted like nothing was wrong. I told her I was tired from work, that I'd had a long day, which wasn't a lie. My mind was racing with all the what-ifs I'd uncovered since morning. She looked beautiful as ever, her smile warm as she greeted me at the door. She poured me a drink, laughed at my half-hearted jokes, and I found myself wondering, how could someone so kind, so gentle, betray me? It felt unthinkable. As she went about her evening, I seized the opportunity to dig a little deeper. While she was in the shower, I unlocked her phone. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through her texts, my eyes flicking over conversations with friends, family, co-workers. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I noticed a name that I didn't recognize, a recent contact. Just a single letter, R. Casual, but somehow deliberate. The message thread was thin, sparse, just the odd exchange about meeting up, both keeping it vague, almost as if they knew to avoid specifics. My stomach churned as I read their latest exchange. Same place. She'd texted 2 nights ago. Usual time, came the reply. My throat was tight, a bitter taste flooding my mouth. I knew that place. It was a small, out-of-the-way cafe, the kind of spot where people went to hide. I felt like the walls were closing in around me, like I'd stepped onto a stage in some nightmare. My mind raced, darting between anger, pain, and panic. When she came back from the shower, I was calm, too calm, probably, but she didn't seem to notice. She slipped into bed beside me, her hand resting on my shoulder, her body close. It felt like nothing had changed, even though my whole world was unraveling. In the darkness, I lay awake for hours, planning my next move, while Claire slept soundly beside me. I would confront her, no question about it. I'd gather all the proof I needed, and I'd be done with it. She'd ruined everything we'd built, and I'd make sure she knew just what she was losing. But first, I'd need more than a name and a few cryptic texts. I'd need to be sure, even if every part of me was screaming that I already knew the truth. The next morning, I was out the door before dawn, leaving a quick note on the kitchen counter. Something about an early meeting downtown, a white lie that slid off my tongue as easily as a sigh. I couldn't look her in the eyes that morning, not when every glance, every touch felt like a betrayal. I could barely keep it together. My mind was spinning with questions, each one darker than the last. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house, with that receipt, with her. As I drove through the city, the cool morning air seeping through the windows, I felt a clarity creeping in. I was going to hire a private investigator. It was the only way I'd get the truth, raw and undeniable. I needed answers, but I also needed someone who could stay objective, who could look at this mess without my broken heart clouding their judgment. I made a few calls, and by mid-morning, I was sitting across from a man named Frank, a retired cop turned PI with a stern face and a gaze that could slice through steel. His office was small, cluttered with dusty case files and faded photographs, but he seemed sharp, like he missed nothing. "So, you're suspecting infidelity?" he said, his tone calm but direct. I nodded, feeling the bile rise in my throat as I forced out a few details. I handed him the crumpled receipt, described the messages, the late nights, the trips that I now knew weren't with friends. Frank nodded, taking notes, his expression giving nothing away. "We can run surveillance. I'll assign someone discreet, someone who won't raise any suspicions. They'll tail her, document her movements, collect any hard evidence we can use. If she's meeting someone, we'll get photos, timestamps, anything that'll hold up in court." The word court struck me. I hadn't even thought that far, hadn't even processed the idea that this might end in lawyers, in splitting up assets, in filing for divorce. A marriage I'd thought was rock solid, a future I trusted, now on the verge of collapsing. I swallowed hard, nodded, and left the office feeling like I was moving underwater, every step heavy with dread. The next few days were a nightmare of pretending, of forced smiles and strained conversations. I didn't know who I was anymore, or who Claire had become, and that was the worst part. She'd seemed so happy, so carefree, and I realized that was probably the real deception. She wasn't hiding because she was guilty. She was hiding because she was free, while I was the one trapped in our crumbling reality. Then, one evening, Frank called. His voice was steady, professional, but I could sense something there, a slight pause that warned me I wouldn't like what he had to say. "I think you should see this for yourself," he said, and my heart sank. I drove to his office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. By the time I arrived, I was drenched in sweat, my nerves shredded. In the dim light of his office, Frank laid out a series of photographs, each one capturing moments that hit like a punch to the gut. There was Claire, looking radiant, relaxed, laughing in a way she hadn't laughed with me in months. And there was a man, tall, sharply dressed, with his arm around her. In each frame, they looked closer, more intimate, like they were sharing a world where I didn't exist. They were at the cafe, then later, in a secluded corner of a park I knew all too well. The photos were clear, undeniable, and yet I found myself reaching for excuses, for any explanation other than the one staring me in the face. I'd spent years with her, trusted her with everything. She'd been my anchor, my best friend, and here she was, erasing me from her life, one stolen moment at a time. My hands trembled as I put the photos back down. Frank was watching me, his face expressionless, waiting for my reaction. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "That's up to you," he replied. "I can keep digging, find out more about this guy, his background, his intentions. Or you can go straight to a lawyer. Depends how you want to play this." The word lawyer came back, sharper this time, like a blade pressing against my skin. The idea of divorce, of dividing everything, of exposing this whole sordid affair to the world made me sick. But at that moment, I didn't see any other choice. Claire had lied to me, broken every promise, and left me with nothing but ashes of the life we'd built together. I left Frank's office with a new resolve, a numb determination that felt more like survival than strength. I called a lawyer that night, a no-nonsense guy recommended by a friend. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who'd seen all of this before. He told me we'd meet in a few days, that I'd need to gather any documents, any evidence I had. "We'll make sure you get your fair share," he assured me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was no fairness in any of this. That night, I lay awake beside Claire, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. She slept soundly, her breaths even and calm, like she had nothing to hide. And maybe for her, that was true. Maybe she'd already made her choice, already moved on. But I wasn't done fighting. I was going to make sure she paid for what she'd done to me, to us. This was just the beginning. The days blurred together, a mixture of numb routine and simmering anger. Claire moved around the house as if everything were normal, laughing, making plans, tossing casual remarks my way as if she hadn't just detonated our life together. And maybe she believed that I didn't know. But every word, every gesture felt like poison now, a reminder of the lie she'd spun around us, around me. I barely slept, barely ate, my mind fixed on one thing. Getting through this, taking back what was mine. The lawyer I'd hired, Paul, was sharp, decisive, and clear-eyed. We met again the following week, a briefcase full of documents sprawled out between us. I handed over the photos Frank had gathered, along with a summary of my suspicions and any evidence I'd managed to gather myself. Paul looked through it all in silence, occasionally nodding, scribbling notes on a legal pad. "You're in a good position, Greg," he said finally, his voice calm and reassuring. "Adultery cases can be tricky, but with evidence like this, it should tip the scales in your favor. We'll file for divorce, and with this proof of infidelity, you'll have leverage on your side. Most judges don't look kindly on cheaters." A small flame of hope flickered to life in me. For the first time since I'd seen those photos, I felt like maybe I could win this, like maybe I'd come out of this mess with some sense of justice. I was tired of feeling like the victim, tired of being blindsided. But then Paul's voice cut through my thoughts. "There's one thing you need to know, though," he said, tapping his pen on the table. "Claire's hired someone. Jonathan Roberts." My stomach twisted at the name. I'd heard of Roberts. He was notorious in our town for taking on high-stakes divorce cases, the type that turned dirty fast. He had a reputation for playing rough, for twisting facts and manipulating evidence. If Claire had gone to him, she wasn't just looking to defend herself. She was out for blood. "Roberts will use everything he can find against you," Paul warned, his eyes locked on mine. "Any minor slip-up, any inconsistency, he'll magnify. We need to be airtight, Greg. This is war now. If you want to come out with anything close to what you deserve, you'll need to prepare for the worst." The words hung heavy in the air. It wasn't just a divorce anymore. It was a battleground. Claire was going to fight, and she was going to fight dirty. And she'd come armed with one of the most ruthless attorneys around. I didn't know whether to be angry or terrified. The next few weeks were a brutal cycle of legal meetings, document preparations, and, more than anything, waiting. Frank continued his surveillance, gathering more photos and details of her meetings with the other man. A guy named Richard Whitman, as it turned out, a slick businessman from out of town. Apparently, she'd been seeing him for months, sneaking around, letting herself slip into another life while I'd been sitting at home like an idiot. Then, the first court date arrived. I arrived early, standing in the hallway, feeling the quiet tension building around me. The courtroom was cold and stark, all wood paneling and echoing footsteps. Claire arrived soon after, dressed to perfection, her expression blank, unreadable. And there, trailing behind her like a shadow, was Roberts himself. He had a presence about him, a self-assuredness that made my skin crawl. He looked at me with a casual smirk, like he'd already won. The hearing was brutal, and it became clear almost immediately that Roberts had come prepared to dismantle me. He questioned everything, from my financial decisions to the integrity of my evidence. He claimed the photos were inconclusive, that they didn't prove anything beyond innocent meetings. He even suggested that I'd been the one engaging in deceit, planting seeds of doubt about my character in front of the judge. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and I could feel myself slipping under the weight of his words. Then came the blow that took me by complete surprise. Roberts produced a document I'd never seen before. A prenuptial agreement, supposedly signed by me and Claire years ago, stating that in the event of a divorce, I would walk away with nothing. My heart stopped as I stared at the paper, my signature scrawled at the bottom. But I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I'd never signed anything like that. Claire's attorney looked at me with that same smirk, and I realized in that moment just how far they were willing to go. Paul jumped to his feet, challenging the document's authenticity, demanding proof. But Roberts brushed it off smoothly, claiming the original was somewhere in storage and that this was a copy. It was enough to muddy the waters, to make the judge pause and consider that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the one telling the truth. The tides were turning, and I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. I left the courtroom feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, every ounce of hope drained from me. It was as if my life was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, by the woman I'd once loved and trusted with everything. The prenuptial agreement was a devastating blow, one I hadn't anticipated. I was furious, not just with her, but with myself for letting it get this far, for not seeing this side of her sooner. As I walked out of the courthouse, Robert shot me a final look, one that said it all. He wasn't done. He hadn't even started. I could see it in his eyes. The game had only just begun, and he was prepared to drag me through hell and back if it meant Claire got everything. But I wasn't done fighting either. They might have knocked me down, but I was far from finished. I'd lost the first round, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days following that courtroom ambush were a haze of fury and disbelief. The idea that Claire could forge a document, something as serious as a prenuptial agreement, had me reeling. But what hit hardest was that she'd known me well enough to anticipate my every move, had come armed with a ruthless plan to turn every ounce of my loyalty against me. The woman I'd spent a decade with was now a stranger, one willing to destroy me, lie after lie. After that day, I threw myself into preparing for the next hearing. Paul and I met nearly every evening, poring over every scrap of evidence, working late into the night. He was relentless, piecing together my defense and setting traps for Roberts, but I could tell he was concerned. Roberts plays dirty, Greg. We need rock-solid proof, something indisputable that will pull the rug out from under him. He's a master at creating doubt, and the judge is already leaning his way. But it felt like every corner we turned, every attempt we made to push back, was met with another roadblock. Somehow, Claire's lawyer was always one step ahead, ready to challenge every piece of evidence, twist every fact. He questioned my honesty, brought up minor financial inconsistencies, even tried to portray me as an unstable husband. The judge, unfazed, listened to him as if every word out of his mouth was gospel truth. I could feel my control slipping, like sand through my fingers. Then, as we were digging through old records one night, Frank, the PI, called with something that sent a spark of hope surging through me. "Greg," he said, his voice a touch more animated than usual. "I did some digging on this Richard Whitman guy, Claire's friend." The way he hesitated over the word friend told me all I needed to know. Turns out, he's got a history. He was involved in a corporate fraud case a few years back. Nothing conclusive, and he got off with a slap on the wrist. But there's a paper trail. And Greg, I think we can use this. This was a crack in the facade. A chance to prove that Claire's affair wasn't some innocent relationship, but something more sinister, something calculated. Paul agreed it was worth pursuing. He wanted to show that Claire had allied herself with a known fraudster, that she wasn't just unfaithful but reckless, willing to risk our assets with someone who had a shady past. We took this information to the next hearing, and when Paul brought it up, I watched Claire's expression shift. Just for a second, there was a flicker of something. Panic, maybe, or anger. Roberts, though, was already countering, spinning a story about how Richard had reformed, and that any attempt to link Claire to his past indiscretions was character assassination. Still, I could see that we'd rattled them. But then Roberts hit back with something I couldn't have predicted. The next day, I woke up to a sheriff pounding on my door with a search warrant. They claimed to have received an anonymous tip that I was hiding drugs in my home. Drugs. I barely drank, let alone touched anything illegal. I stood there, stunned. as officers swarmed my house, tearing through drawers, checking cabinets, turning over furniture. And that's when they found it. In the corner of my closet, buried beneath some old coats, was a bag of white powder. Cocaine, they said. Enough to suggest intent to distribute. My hands were shaking as they snapped on the cuffs, reading me my rights. I could barely process it. I knew, this was Roberts's work. But how could I prove that? And who would believe me? They held me for questioning, pushing me to admit to things I hadn't done, as if waiting for me to slip up. I spent hours in a sterile interrogation room, my mind racing, anger simmering below the surface. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, they released me, pending further investigation. But the damage was done. The arrest was on record, another mark against me in court, another shadow Roberts could use to paint me as unstable, dangerous even. When I finally made it home, exhausted and furious, I found Paul waiting for me, his face drawn and pale. "We're in trouble, Greg," he said quietly, as though afraid to push me over the edge. "This stunt they pulled? It's going to weigh heavily with the judge. Roberts is creating a narrative of you as erratic, out of control, desperate. This might have just turned the case." For the first time, I felt the bitter edge of hopelessness creep in. It was as if every move I made, Roberts and Claire had already anticipated. They were boxing me in, trapping me with lies I couldn't disprove, stories I couldn't untangle. I couldn't believe it. The lengths Claire was willing to go to erase me, to walk away with everything. How could I have ever loved someone capable of this? But as I sat there, numb and drained, something in me hardened. This wasn't just a fight for money or for a house. This was a fight for my name, for my life, for whatever was left of my dignity. I wasn't about to let them bury me without a fight. I had nothing left to lose, and that made me dangerous. If they wanted to play dirty, fine. I would find a way to hit back, to expose every lie, every deception. I met Paul's gaze, my voice cold and steady. "We're not backing down. If they want a war, we'll give them one. Whatever it takes." The days following my arrest were an emotional whirlwind. I couldn't step outside without feeling eyes on me. Neighbors looked at me differently, whispering as I walked by, and friends I'd once trusted kept their distance. The rumor mill was spinning fast, fueled by the spectacle Roberts had orchestrated, and I was being painted as an unhinged, drug-dealing mess. The weight of it all was suffocating, but beneath the exhaustion, a fierce determination was building. I wasn't done, not by a long shot. Paul was relentless, though I could see the strain starting to show in his eyes, the way he pressed his temples during late-night strategy meetings. We spent hours dissecting every move Roberts had made, looking for weaknesses, inconsistencies, anything that could break this nightmare narrative they'd constructed around me. "We need a witness," Paul muttered one night, pacing the length of my living room, his gaze intense. "Someone who can speak to Claire's intentions, to her character. A friend, an old coworker, anyone who's seen what's really going on here. If we can prove her manipulation, the judge might reconsider the character assessment they've built against you." But finding someone willing to speak up for me was easier said than done. Many of our mutual friends had already picked sides, and those who hadn't were terrified of Roberts and his smear tactics. He'd threatened witnesses before, intimidating them into silence. I realized with a sinking feeling that Roberts wasn't just manipulating the law, he was controlling it. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, a small sliver of hope appeared where I least expected it. One evening, as I was going through old files, a name flashed across my phone screen. It was Frank, the PI, calling with something that sounded urgent. His voice was low, almost cautious. "I've been digging deeper into Richard Whitman's background," he said, and I could sense a hint of triumph in his tone. "Turns out, Whitman's company is linked to a series of offshore accounts that are, let's just say, highly suspect. Money laundering, shell corporations, tax evasion, all under the radar, but I've managed to pull a few connections. This guy's neck deep in illegal activity, and Claire's been seen in several business meetings with him, some even linked to these accounts." A jolt of adrenaline shot through me. This was the first real piece of leverage we had. If Claire was involved with someone this shady, someone with his hands in a criminal operation, It could not only discredit her but also question her financial intentions in this case. The judge would have to look closer at her motivations, at why she was so eager to strip me of everything I had. The next morning, Paul and I met to go over this new evidence. We decided to file a motion, requesting a full investigation into Claire's financial activities with Whitman. It was risky. Roberts would do everything in his power to block it, but we had no choice. This was our opening, our chance to strike back. At the next hearing, I could feel the tension before we even stepped into the courtroom. Claire sat across from me, her expression unreadable, her hands folded neatly on the table. Roberts, however, looked less at ease. I could tell he was on guard, his gaze flicking between Paul and me, searching for any sign of our plan. Paul rose to present our motion, laying out the connections between Whitman and the criminal accounts Frank had uncovered. He argued that Claire's association with Whitman called her financial motives into question and requested that the court allow a full audit of her accounts to trace any involvement in Whitman's shady dealings. The courtroom was silent as he spoke, every word landing like a blow. But Roberts, always poised, was quick to counter. He argued that the motion was nothing more than its smokescreen, a desperate attempt by a guilty husband to tarnish his innocent wife's reputation. He spoke with conviction, spinning a tale of my supposed erratic and dangerous behavior, suggesting that I was grasping at straws to save face. His words stung, but I could see he was rattled. The judge, to my surprise, didn't dismiss our motion outright. Instead, he ordered a brief recess, promising to review the evidence. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was something. For the first time, it felt like we'd managed to disrupt their relentless assault. During the recess, I stepped outside the courthouse to clear my head, watching people pass by as if they had no idea of the chaos consuming my life. Claire appeared a moment later, standing just a few feet away, close enough to talk but far enough to keep her distance. I felt a pang of anger looking at her, remembering the woman I thought I knew, and the stranger she'd become. "You won't win, you know," she said softly, her voice cold, almost pitying. "Roberts knows exactly what he's doing. He's the best, Greg. You don't stand a chance." I met her gaze, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "You're underestimating me, Claire," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "And you're underestimating the truth. People like Roberts? They can only twist it for so long. Eventually, it'll catch up to you." She gave a slight, dismissive smile, as if my words were nothing more than a minor inconvenience, then turned and walked back inside. Watching her, I realized how far gone she was, how determined she was to erase every trace of me from her life, no matter the cost. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge addressed us with a solemn expression. He had reviewed our motion, he announced, and found enough grounds to authorize a preliminary investigation into Claire's accounts. He warned us that this was not a decision taken lightly, and that any findings would be handled with utmost scrutiny. The look on Roberts's face was priceless. He hadn't anticipated this, hadn't prepared for it. As we left the courthouse that day, I felt a renewed sense of strength. I knew the road ahead was still dangerous, but we had finally gained some ground. It was a small win, but it was a win. For the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to reclaim my life from the ashes Claire had left behind. The courtroom was tense, a silent battleground where every glance, every motion carried the weight of all that had come before. I could feel the hostility, the simmering anger radiating off of Claire as she sat across from me, arms folded, her face set in a mask of feigned innocence. Roberts, as usual, was calm and poised, exuding the smug confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. But he hadn't accounted for everything, not this time. Paul, my attorney, rose to his feet, his voice steady and clear as he introduced the new evidence. He began with the web of financial connections Frank had uncovered, detailing Richard's offshore accounts, the suspicious money transfers, the untraceable funds. The courtroom grew quiet, every eye fixed on Paul as he methodically explained how Claire's relationship with Richard wasn't just personal, it was financial. He outlined how Claire's financial records overlapped with those questionable transactions, suggesting that she, too, had a stake in Richard's illegal dealings. Roberts objected, of course. He argued that this was an irrelevant character assassination, that it had no bearing on the divorce itself, but the judge listened intently, his gaze shifting between Roberts, Claire, and the evidence before him. I could see the first cracks in Claire's composure. She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to grab something, anything, to keep herself steady. But Paul wasn't done. "We'd like to submit this," Paul said, holding up a thick packet of emails, each one detailing a correspondence between Claire and Richard. In these exchanges, they openly discussed how to move money, how to reallocate assets, and even hints at their strategy for framing me as unfit, unstable, dangerous. The judge's face darkened as he read through the lines, his frown deepening with each page. I could see Roberts's confidence wavering as he tried to object again, insisting that these emails were personal and that they proved nothing. Paul countered, his voice calm but relentless. "Your Honor, this is clear evidence that my client was systematically framed by Mrs. Lawrence and her accomplice. This entire case was engineered to strip Mr. Lawrence of his assets, using fabricated evidence and deceitful tactics." The judge finally looked directly at Claire, his gaze sharp, piercing. "Mrs. Lawrence, can you explain your involvement with these transactions and the content of these emails?" Claire opened her mouth, but no words came. For the first time, she looked truly cornered. Richard sat in the back of the courtroom, his expression tight and unreadable. It was clear he hadn't anticipated being pulled into the spotlight, and the attention on him only heightened the tension. I could see him glancing at Claire, his face twisted in frustration, almost as if he were starting to realize that her loyalty might not be worth the risk. Then, in a move I hadn't expected, Richard stood up, clearing his throat. He addressed the judge directly. "I'd like to clarify that my financial dealings are separate from Mrs. Lawrence's divorce case. Any association with her is purely incidental," he said, his voice stiff, formal. He was trying to distance himself, to shield himself from the scandal now threatening to consume both of them. But it was too late. The judge motioned for Richard to remain silent and signaled for the bailiff to retrieve all relevant documents. He looked at Roberts, his face tight with disapproval. "Mr. Roberts, I'm concerned about the integrity of this case. We'll be examining Mrs. Lawrence's finances and all evidence presented here with rigorous scrutiny. This will include an independent audit of her financial activities and further investigation into these alleged attempts at defamation." Roberts looked furious, his jaw clenched. Claire's face had drained of color. I could almost see the plans unraveling in her mind, her carefully constructed web of lies falling apart thread by thread. She seemed to realize that she was losing control of the narrative, that her once airtight case was slipping through her fingers. Paul and I exchanged a glance. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of victory, a sense that justice was finally catching up to her. The judge ordered a continuation of the investigation, and court was adjourned for the day. I stood up, feeling the weight lifting off my shoulders, though the tension still lingered, knowing there were still loose ends. As I walked past Claire, she shot me a look that was both desperate and filled with venom. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "This isn't over, Greg." I looked at her, feeling nothing but a calm, quiet resolve. "You did this to yourself, Claire. The lies. They catch up to everyone eventually." Roberts pulled her aside, speaking in hushed tones as I walked out of the courtroom, feeling the first true sense of peace I'd felt in months. I knew this wasn't quite the end, but it was a start. And for the first time, I felt like I had a fighting chance to rebuild my life, free from the grip of her deceit. The investigation took weeks, stretching on with tense, drawn-out court appearances and additional hearings. The evidence against Claire only grew stronger, each revelation peeling back layers of deception, manipulation, and greed. The final blow came when Richard, in a desperate bid to save his own reputation, testified against her. In a cold, detached statement, he admitted that their relationship was largely transactional and that he'd been aware of her intentions to manipulate the divorce proceedings for financial gain. The judge, now convinced of Claire's deliberate malfeasance, ruled in my favor. Not only did I retain a significant portion of my assets, but Claire was also ordered to pay substantial penalties for her fraudulent actions. Roberts faced consequences as well. His shady tactics and willingness to deceive the court led to an inquiry into his legal practices, putting his career at risk. Claire, once surrounded by her illusions of control, found herself isolated, her carefully cultivated reputation shattered. With the legal battle over, I returned to a quieter life, one no longer dominated by betrayal and the painful reminders of what I'd lost. There was a strange peace in letting it all go, in finally closing the door on the life I'd shared with Claire. I sold the house, moved to a smaller town where nobody knew my story, and started over. Months passed, and gradually, the weight of everything I'd endured began to lift. I rebuilt my career, found new friends, reconnected with family members I distanced myself from during the chaos. There were scars, of course, remnants of the life I'd left behind, but they reminded me of the strength it had taken to move on. One evening, I received a letter from Claire. I opened it with a mix of curiosity and caution, half expecting more accusations or bitterness. But it was short, surprisingly apologetic, acknowledging, perhaps for the first time, the pain she'd caused. I felt no desire to respond. I'd made my peace. Her words couldn't touch me now. In the end, I found a kind of freedom I hadn't known before, a sense of self beyond the betrayal and lies. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine, and that, I realized, was more than enough.